All right, so here we find ourselves about halfway through Catcher in the Rye. Hopefully, you're enjoying it so far. A lot of stuff has happened, or maybe nothing's happened. I don't know. I guess it depends on how you look at it. But either way, more is to come. And in the first half of the novel, we were really looking at the what, what existed in the novel as far as some of the literary concepts and basics. We're looking at themes, motifs, and symbols, and characterization, and stream of consciousness, and all those things. And while those things are very important, simply being able to recognize where they exist is not enough. We have to start now looking at why they're there. Why would the author create symbols with those attached meanings? Why would the author create these reoccurring ideas of depression, suicide, sexuality, alcoholism, addiction, um, um, irresponsible behavior? Why would he keep bringing these ideas forward? And why would the author choose to characterize Holden in the way he did? And why would the author choose to write in stream of consciousness style of writing? Um, we're going to start exploring those things. And I think the foundation of that, the next step of that, is looking at some of the psychology components to who Holden is. And once we kind of understand some of the basic psychological, um, perhaps principles that are dictating Holden's behavior, we can maybe then begin to apply this to the authorial intent and ultimately possibly discover why Holden is the way he is and why was he created the way he was created. But first, let's take a look at some stuff pertaining to psychology. So James Marcia, who is an adolescent psychologist, he had this idea that in order for an individual to develop a clear sense of self, to navigate through the trials and tribulations of discovering their identity, they must first recognize, accept, and um, learn to live, I guess, with the following three things. The first thing is sexual orientation. So at some point, the person must come to terms with their sexual orientation, and for some people, obviously, that can be a really big challenge. That can be a struggle for them. And if they're unable to come to terms with their sexuality, with their sexual orientation, a clear sense of identity is going to be is going to be difficult to establish. Um, so that's the first thing. The second thing that he also states is a set of values and ideals. Now, a lot of times we think about, the values and ideals that our parents instilled us with, and those may be perfectly fine. But he also stresses the importance of the individual establishing their own values and ideals. For example, are if your parents have always raised you with, let's say, in the Jewish faith, and you decide, you know what, you don't want to be Jewish, you want to be a Muslim. Making that switch and establishing those values and ideals for yourself and what works for you, that is what James Marsh is talking about. For some of us, it could be easy because we agree with the values and ideals that our parents have instilled us with. But for some of us, it may not be that simple. So establishing your own personal values and ideals, that is essential to establishing who you are and navigating your identity. And the last thing is a vocational direction. And what that simply means is, what do you want to do? What's your job? What are you going to do for the rest of your life? I felt very fortunate that I knew at a very young age that I wanted to be a teacher. And shortly after that, I decided that I wanted to be a high school English teacher. And I never really looked back. But a lot of people go through massive confusion when it comes to deciding a career and an occupation. Um, that might happen as a teenager. That might happen as a 50-year-old person. So, but establishing what you want to do with your life and being satisfied with your job and being satisfied with what it is you're contributing is essential to establishing your sense of identity. So, all three of those things play into this next idea, which are the four identity statuses. Now, I want to stress that these identity statuses do not operate in order. It's not as if you go through foreclosure, diffusion, then moratorium. You can find yourself in diffusion, then you go to achievement, then you go back to moratorium, maybe up to foreclosure. You move through this in your own way, and some people never find themselves in some of these statuses, and that's perfectly fine too. But while we're going over this, I want you to think about two things. I want you to think about where you find yourself? What identity status can you identify with? And where do you think Holden finds himself in this current stage of the novel? So the first identity status is foreclosure. And this means that the individual has not experienced an identity crisis because everything's kind of been determined for them. Their values and beliefs are given to them. Their occupation is given to them. And to an extent, maybe possibly they don't feel as if um, their sexual orientation is going to be accepted by their family or friends, and so they kind of ignore that part of themselves and find them and ultimately find themselves in a state of foreclosure, in a state of identity foreclosure. But ultimately, you're not experiencing the identity crisis because all three of those things that were mentioned on the previous slide have been decided for you. The next one is diffusion. Diffusion is where you have not decided on any of those three things. You haven't come to terms with any of those three components on the previous slide, and you're not really trying to figure them out because you fear what you might find on the other side. So a lot of people might find themselves, they don't want to think about what they're going to do in college because it's too fearful and it's scary, and they'd rather not think about it. They'd rather not explore the options because it's frightening. Um, the next one that we could find ourselves in is moratorium. And a lot of people, I think this is a really common one for a lot of people. They experience an identity crisis, but they're moving towards resolving and making decisions about their future. So they perhaps recognize, are beginning to recognize what they value and what they believe for themselves and perhaps the world that they find themselves in. And they're coming to terms with those values and beliefs. Perhaps they are coming to terms with, the fact I found myself in moratorium at one point when I thought, I think I want to be a teacher. And the next step was, well, what kind of teacher do I want to be? And the next step after that was, well, where do I want to go to school? And so all three of those decisions kind of were found in that moratorium stage because I was actively making choices about my future. I was still in the identity crisis because I wasn't sure about everything, but I was making choices to achieve. And the last thing is achievement, where this is where you are where you kind of want to be. You've successfully navigated through the identity crisis and you've made decisions or you have come to terms with the individual self. But there's nothing that you're continuing to hold back. You feel good about everything that was mentioned on the previous slide. You feel good about about your values and beliefs. You have come to terms and can accept your sexual identity and your sexual orientation, and you feel good about your vocational direction. You feel good about what you probably might maybe want to do about for the rest of your life. It's not to say though that once you're in achievement, you could not go back to diffusion. It's not to say that if you're in diffusion, you're a hopeless cause. There's lots of variations on these four identity statuses, but I want you to think about again, where do you find yourself right now? Where do you think Holden finds himself right now? And we're going to take this information and we're going to look at some authorial intent stuff on another video, and we're going to apply this to that authorial intent and begin to discover maybe why J.D. Salinger created Holden the way he did. So that is it for some psychology stuff with Catcher in the Rye. I hope you learned something with this. But take a look at this and then again apply this information to your future reading of Catcher in the Rye and to our discussion of authorial intent. That wraps it up. I'll see you soon. I'll talk to you soon.